We'd love to hear from you. And maybe Tawfiq has a microphone. And I would like a student, perhaps, to ask the first question, if any students would like to ask a question. Back there, we'll have a graduate student, and then I don't know who's an undergraduate, but maybe, yeah. So, yes, back there.
Hi, I'm a graduate student at the Executive Master of International Service, American University. My question is about building coalition, and I want to know if there's like other actors surrounding you or you're building coalition with them who are pushing to decentralization in Egypt too. And do you think that is coming like in the near future? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Let's take a couple of them, okay? And then we can respond. Thank you. I think there's some questions over here, Tawfiq. I have some student questions, and then we'll get to the...
Hi, my name is Erica Nguenia, and I'm in the SIS Master's Program. I just had a question if there's a role for the U.S. or other actors to play in helping Egypt achieve sort of better localized government, sort of outside of Cairo, but in sort of other areas of Egypt, if there's any kind of role we can play, or if this is just something we have to watch and wait for.
Great question. This one?
Hi, my name is Layla Al-Khafefi. I'm an undergraduate in SIS. I just had a question about, I know we've talked about that you've discussed the specific city of Cairo. As someone who's interested in the specific revolutionary case in Libya, if you have any suggestions on how to begin starting organizations like this and collaborating with people that are still within like the major cities of Benghazi and Tripoli. Thanks.
Great. Eddie? Oh, sorry.
If it's
Go
all
ahead.
right.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm Kayla. I'm also an undergraduate in SIS and CIS. And actually, my question was specific to David, actually, based off of your presentation where you talked a lot about the urban development of Cairo before Nasser and the developments that happened after the revolution, and then the future plans for that. But I was wondering if you could kind of build on to what extent urbanization created an environment for the revolution and what led to supporting the revolution from an urban sense. So.
And then the last one, Eddie?
Okay, so I was going to essentially ask, I know there is certainly a lack of local institutions in Egypt and much of the developing world, but what kind of parallels do you see between the general lack of localized institutions politically in the developing world and then, say, here in the US with like the complete ineffectiveness of localized institutions and even nationalized institutions in the US? Because in many ways the problems are fairly similar, because and also I guess this is a supplementary question, you also talked about like articulating demands, and I was curious if you could clarify more about that, because like certainly there's no shortage of demands throughout the last 3 years. So I guess maybe that has to do more with organizing the articulation of demands.
Okay. Why don't we just take a couple more questions from the front, and then we'll start responding. Judy?
Good morning. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Just a quick comment and then a question. I would argue that the residents of informal settlements are maybe the original revolutionaries, in the sense that they were taking over space and organizing it in their own terms, and actually being very creative in coming up with solutions to local problems, including provision of housing, schools, clinics, and so forth. And so arguably one of the key needs is to reframe the role of the Ashawiyat, the informal settlements, as being successful examples of local initiative that provides solutions that are devised by local residents. And they're widely castigated as being places where people are breaking the law and so forth by building housing and so forth. But in fact, they represent in many ways a very positive example. My other quick comment also is the need to really equip people at the local level to, if you will, follow the money. Develop the hard skills of learning how to monitor public finances and expenditures and budgeting processes, which is a skill that's widely lacking at all levels in Egypt, including within the government, as well as in civil society. And then finally, just a question. I know there were a bunch of organizations that were working together before at various stages over the past 3 years in trying to lobby for the promotion of a right to information law. And there were various drafts that were being passed around and so forth. And I kind of took my eye off the ball, and I'm not sure what actually ended up in the 2014 Constitution in terms of a formal right to information. If you could just comment on that.
And last one here, and then we'll take another round.
Hi, I'm Malini, and I'm assistant professor here at SIS. I was wondering if you could unpack the state a little bit more for us. I really appreciated the discussant's comment about collapsing informality, and not getting caught up with this binary. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the complicity of the state in the production of informality, which is something you see in urban India a lot. And you know, on the one hand, you have lower level municipal functionaries sort of turning a blind eye, and in some ways, there's a de facto sanctioning of middle class groups, lower middle class groups, building their own settlements and, you know, flouting certain zoning laws. On the other hand, you have other arms of the state that then will turn around and slap these fees, regularization fees and penalties, and then, you know, in the extreme case, eviction of these informal households. So the state is very heterogeneous. And to what extent is the state actually heterogeneous and complicit then in the production of informality in Egypt as well? Thanks.
Great. Kareem, can you hear us? Hello, Kareem? No, maybe. Can you hear the discussion, Kareem?
Is the state actually heterogeneous and complicit?
Oh, there's a lag.
He's lagging. Okay.
There's a lag.
Okay, well, let's get started. We'll catch up.
David, why don't you maybe answer that question that was specifically?
Sure.
Kareem, can you hear us?
It's a bit of a delay. All right, well, maybe we should try and restart this.
No, wait, Kareem, can you hear us?
He's delayed.
Yeah,
Yes,
now
yes.
but he's
Okay.
responding to like 5 minutes.
5 minutes
Go
ago.
ahead.
Anyway, as you saw in my presentation, I sort of stayed away from trying to explain the revolution, especially from an urbanization standpoint. Urbanization it's a global phenomenon. This is not unique to Egypt by any stretch of the imagination. And so if it were a function simply of urbanization, there'd be revolution all over the place. Now there is urban unrest all over the place, and you can see protests that have happened across the globe. And so this idea that perhaps it's the relationship of a state's capacity to absorb that protest and to entertain these demands, the Egyptian state was not built to do that very well. And so that may play a part in what's happened there. But certainly, the urban environment, there's been a lot written about public space in the discourse of democracy, in the discourse of any protest really is critical, or public space is critical to that discourse. And you know, it's no coincidence that the revolution unfolded in the most significant intersection or square in Cairo, in the most significant city in the country. And so there is definitely a correlation between the space and the urbanization. But the causation, I stay away from that. There's so many other factors that are going on. But certainly this idea that space involves the lived experience. And in cities, especially as a city like Cairo, it's so intensified that it's the right place for these things to come about when they do. So I hope that answers your question. So.
Although there's a time lag, Kareem, could you perhaps talk about the? Oh, okay. We're gonna say. I will mention, and then maybe Kareem can jump in. The question about the coalition. There are other groups that are definitely working on the ground. There's a group called Mahaliyat, and there was a group called Mahaliyat Saudiya. that have been active. There are people, there's throughout the Middle East, and this relates to the question about Libya as well, there's a kind of a growing constellation of urbanist activists. Some of them are architects, some of them are local NGOs, some of them are people who've been involved in historic preservation and have gotten more interested in the political side of things as they see that sort of heritage for tourism has kind of been much more important than integrating a community with sort of heritage and restoration of heritage and things like that. There's questions about who benefits from the touristic emphasis on restoring older parts of communities and such. But there definitely are other actors, there's other political actors and NGOs that are interested in local government. But in general, I would say there's not the democratization crowd, the people who are interested in free and fair elections do not spend much time about sort of local elections and such. In terms of the Egyptian coalition, Kareem can add to this, but there are long-standing actors like Yahya Shaukat from the Shadow Ministry of Housing. There's a proliferation of people who have blogs and organizations. The Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights is involved. The Housing and Lands Rights Network is involved. There's about 8 different organizations, and hopefully there will be more. I mean, we hope the coalition actually, we do not want it just to be the NGO crowd and human rights activists. We also want to reach out to residents and at the local community level. Of course, all of this goes back to the question about what's legal and what the state will tolerate under the current conditions of a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity, a lot of repression. So that's a big question.
I want to address Melanie's question about unpacking the state and the production of informality. Absolutely, yes. In the instance, there's this general sense that the state doesn't want informality to spread. It's an official policy. These are illegal settlements. But in the context of the enormous growth, of the same amount that's happening in India and in Brazil and some of the larger countries, there is turning a blind eye. There is a need to allow these settlements to exist because if they don't, where do people live? There's an instance in the mid-1980s. There were several plans done by the World Bank, USAID, and a French institution that really called for semi-formal development to help the east-west expansion of the city. In the state, there were several factors involved, but ultimately what it came down to is they just rejected the plans outright because nobody wanted to be seen as the official who allowed slums to be developed in their city. So the sites and services approach, which makes a lot of sense, and it still does. Sites and services, for those of you unfamiliar, you simply lay the infrastructure and you plot out land, and then you let people build as they need to. So it's a semi-formal process, and you don't have the issue of having to put infrastructure in place when the settlement already exists. There's no need to tear things up. It's much more cost effective. But simply, it wouldn't happen. And also the control of these desert areas by the military is a question that even the planners struggle with in the state. It's a very opaque portfolio of investments and holdings that people are still unpacking and trying to figure out. So the expansion into farmland, the farmland is a critical asset to the country, yet it's the only place where people can really go because that farmland is owned by local people and can be bought and sold. However informally it is. And so it's the only place where they can go. And then, of course, the government is spending money on massive reclamation projects so they can have more farmland. So, yeah, certainly there's a lot. The state is involved in this informal process, and it's a necessary piece of the urbanization. So.
Sorry, can I just add two things, and then Kareem can also speak about this question. I mean, yes, the government sort of let this happen, but it stopped letting it happen, or it got concerned when Islamist movements were operative in these areas. So sort of informal areas were discovered in the late 90s when Islamist movements were really active in this area. And so that's when the state all of a sudden is concerned about these communities, and that's where when the state decides it needs to upgrade areas because it has to have police stations and fire stations and control and surveillance. And there's also, of course, a discourse of upgrading and the sort of, and so there is definitely complicity, and aside from complicity, an investment of public resources in the new cities, in middle-class housing and upper middle-class housing, and wanting to attract the investment from abroad and locally for real estate. I mean, Egyptians invest in real estate more than anything else, right? And so that's also that. Kareem, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the questions that have been asked.
Yeah, I cannot hear you very well, but I don't know if you can hear my voice on
Yes,
the other end.
we can hear you well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny how I look like the big brother over there. So anyway, coming back to Julie's question about like production of informality, and actually this is like, I think it's a very good entry point to what we're dealing with here, and also the issue of decentralization and how centralized the state is. What we're dealing with right now is like a very centralized state for like decades that has been mainly controlling most of the assets and of the country itself. We're talking here about like a very centralized state. Diane didn't mention that, but in such a transition to democracy, we're spending only between 12 and 16% of our national budget on the local level. And this shows how deprived the local level is in terms of like distribution and access to resources. And this has been the case for many years. And one of these resources that the country controls, or the state controls, is actually land. And this is one of the main drives of like this informality, that it's like people's access to land is almost like very limited, actually. Only for a very few group of people can access land from an official point of view. This drives a lot of people to actually seek haven in informality over the last 30 years. And if you look at the national budgets, for example, allocated in terms of production of social housing, or the government's role, or the public sector's role in terms of production of like housing and provision of the market, it has been declining over the last decade, deeply declining actually, and you can see it's being replaced by the informal sector. In Egypt, we like both the public and the formal private sector, they produce only 25% of the housing stock that we need every year. Almost 75% is produced by the informal sector. And this is a problem that cannot be overcome by production of more housing, that like what the government is proposing. It's more like giving access to people to land, for example, or dealing with the problem from a completely different perspective. Egypt does not need 1 million housing units. It needs to unlock the existing stock. We don't have, for example, 7 million housing units that are completely locked and unused in the market. And this can actually cover this, like what the government intends to build in the next 5 years by 7 times. The problem is distribution of resources. It's not the lack of resources. So whenever we go in terms of like housing, for example, it can be solved by more measures, actually, and taxation systems that can avail this huge housing stock in the market. We have housing like units more than the households we have in Egypt, and yet we have a crisis in housing. We have to deal with issues like distribution of water, for example, distribution of public services. We see entire neighborhoods, like with almost 1 million inhabitants, with only 1 or 2 schools serving them. And we have like huge densities and classrooms, for example. So, and we cannot attribute that to lack of resources. It's lack of willingness to redistribute these resources in a different manner. And I think the debate in Egypt should not be around like the economic crisis or what can be done. For sure, this has an impact, but actually how to redistribute these resources. And actually, this is a conversation that the regime is avoiding to go into actually so far. We don't see, like, if you implement that on the struggling for like doctors, for example, for minimum and maximum wage. It has been ongoing for the last 3 years with no reaction from the government. In fact, the government is becoming more stubborn vis-a-vis their demands. So unpacking the state and understanding how to reduce informality cannot be separated from the overall like political economy of the country itself.
Kareem, there was a question about what the U.S. could do differently, or what role, or is there a role for U.S. actors in this trying to change the paradigm?
Yeah, I guess there is a major role not only for the U.S. but also international financial institutions. Is to understand that it's like there are a completely different level of action that's taking place on the local level. There needs to be a better understanding, because to offset this bleak image about like politics in Egypt, there are like many reasons of hope. We can see a lot of like community mobilization on the local level that can be actually mobilized and be built upon to have like a huge impact on the local level to meet demands of the people right now. We don't need to wait until 2050 or like to like see a better development in our urban areas. There are solutions that are not escalated and actually that are being overlooked not only by the government but also by development agencies, international development agencies. Second is to know that it's you cannot talk about like any kind of development without real capacity building and democratization of urban policies in Egypt. And unfortunately, this is taking place in many projects that we see that are either funded by development agencies or like international institutions. Is that the whole attention is about like delivering the project in itself, but not the process how this project was delivered. We can see a lot of like international institutions that work with the central government trying to somehow avoid or even working with like the local level. They always say it's corrupt, it's under, it doesn't have enough capacity to handle like such projects, and it's a vicious circle. In the end, the money is invested on the central level, it goes through like big ministries. Nobody's talking about reform of local administration or using this like foreign aid to push forward an agenda for democratization in a country like Egypt, which cannot be actually pushed forward without talking about like the reform of the local administration and the local politics over there. So there are many roles actually that can be played by international players, but more importantly is not to separate the struggle for democracy from our urban issues and urban development policies.
I would also just add that if you look at a lot of the programs, you know, there's a change of leadership at the World Bank and other institutions, but many of the same projects are still the same projects that they were before the revolution. And it's still the U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, and it's still all about foreign investment, and it's still big actors. It's still huge money to ministries, and they're not talking about how to make it possible for smaller actors, for local actors as well. So it's the same paradigm as much as the sort of ministry, sort of the housing paradigm is the same. I know it's getting late. There were a couple more questions. We actually, our food has not arrived apparently. Is that the case still? It is lost between SIS and here. So there are a couple more questions, I think, over here. I'm not sure if Kareem, did you want to say anything else at the moment about some of the other questions, or Adil, or, I mean, yeah.
I'd rather hear from Kareem.
Okay. Kareem, did you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm fine. No, I'm fine then. So
Okay.
if there are any
Other questions over here? Yeah, Ricky?
And now that I have a better idea of what you do, I realize I've been doing some of this work myself in Tunisia, and specifically on the issue of industrial pollution and civic grassroots organization around that. A huge fertilizer factory in the city of Gabas has been polluting the city's water and air for decades. But under Ben Ali, nobody could organize to protest. Suddenly, there's a grassroots movement. There's no information about the health effects because that kind of research, public health research, wasn't permitted. So there's a big catch-up going. And my question to you on this is whether in any of the case studies that you've worked on or elsewhere in Egypt, has there been mobilization around some big polluter, a toxic waste dump in a neighborhood? Because this seems to be a galvanizer of grassroots activism in many parts of the world. And a second question, you guys have focused, at least in your presentation today, on local issues that get people moving. And is there also this kind of activism about citywide issues, like the need to have more green space on a citywide basis, or maybe, I don't know if this is important in Cairo, dedicated bus lanes that don't necessarily impact a single neighborhood? So who's looking after these bigger issues on behalf of Cairenes?
One more question?
Hi, my name is Yahya Shawi. I am not related to the ministry official you mentioned, but up first, thank you for your insight. But I was very interested by that last comment that Dr. Adel made about the political, I guess, future or aspect of the issue. And my question is, so a lot of people argue that the Arab Spring obviously caused this like spike in political participation and thus local initiatives with this issue and everything else pretty much. So do you feel like as the state is now moving back to pretty much what it was 3 or 4 years ago and falling back in the same habits and starting million house projects that don't actually solve the issue, do you believe that these local initiatives will be able to last and cover the deficit of the state, or will they die off? Excuse me. Will they die off as the state falls back into the same pattern? Thank you.
Kareem, did you hear the first question about? Did you hear those questions, Kareem?
Yeah, can you repeat them like very quickly because I didn't hear them very well.
Yeah, the first two I think you'd be best to answer with. The question was, has there been mobilization around large polluters or toxic waste, and how has the environment been used to mobilize people in Cairo? And if you can discuss some of those examples. And then the other one, are there any citywide issues such as green space, or who's taking care of the citywide issues such as green space or bus rapid transit lanes, transportation networks, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, and the second question, please?
That one was to Adel.
But I think you might have some insights about it as well, Kareem. It was about basically the state becoming much more active and perhaps returning to what, pre-revolutionary configuration, and whether or not that possibly suppresses local organizing, and is there a possibility that these initiatives will die down, or are you optimistic that that there will continue to be mobilizing and action on a local level?
Okay, let me go over these questions very quickly, and also come back to a point that was raised by Judy about the low to access to information, so I can end up with that. There are citywide cases, and for example, not even city, nationwide. So in one of the most recent, actually I can talk about two of them, and one of them, Egyptians Against Coal, which is a movement that started very recently with the decision of the Egyptian government to start importing coal to somehow overcome the shortage of energy in Egypt, especially natural gas. So there is a movement right now that is acting on a strategic case like that and talking about the environmental impact of using coal as a source of energy for cement factories. And it's achieving some success. They are having their voices heard right now, and they are supporting the Minister of Environment, which is actually standing against this behavior of the government. There is also another issue which has to do with customer rights approach of something called the Internet Revolution, which is a movement that started only 4 or 5 months ago, calling for better internet services all over the country, and they have been able to inspire thousands of people to take action against the internet companies in the country. And they have been having hundreds of thousands of followers on their social media accounts in only 3 or 4 months. So there is a sense of civil action that is taking place right now that hasn't been before the revolution. And mainly because people started to see that there is an impact of their movement, there is an impact for their mobilization, which is taking us to the second question about the state coming back. In fact, it's a very good question because we predicted that in 2011. And one of the major questions that I've been asking the different groups that I've been interviewing from like local coalitions or community groups, what is going to happen after the states like starts to recollect its power and coming back into its fully fledged practice of authority in terms of like putting their act together and coming back. What's going to happen in terms of like how you're going to act if there is like legally elected councils, locally elected councils in place. And we've been trying to provoke them to answer these questions, actually, because in the end, their answers were limited into 3 different avenues. One of them is to deal completely outside of the system, like groups like April 6th, for example, or the ultras, the groups that are trying to put some pressure on the state, but they're from outside of the system itself. Second is to work as NGOs or like local development associations or foundations or so on and so forth, which is more dealing on the developmental side of the issues and like deal from like a community organization point of view. And third, to get engaged in the political game and to elect or like try to push as much as possible of like youth into the local elected councils. And I guess the answers to me, like, should be completely out of the box. The main problem of these groups is representation. It's not only representation against the state, but also representation vis-a-vis their own communities. The main problem here we're dealing with, we're like talking about like a group of people who are mobilized within a community to address a certain case or a certain issue within their community. In some cases, they don't have enough bases within their local communities. And in some others, they have been asked by the state, who are you representing? And once you have local elected councils in place, they're going to be completely taken out of the picture. So what we're trying to propose to them is that, what about models like direct democracy? What about models about like participatory budgeting that can allow huge numbers of inhabitants to get engaged in the political game and to have an impact on the decisions taken about their neighborhood? For sure, they are being threatened by like putting back local elected councils following the same like business as usual case in Egypt before the revolution. And unfortunately, the amendments in the constitution and the new constitution does not provide a better practice. It's still like it's fulfilling the same old like conditions of the previous regime. And finally, talking about like a law like the access to information, the question is not how far we progressed about the Act for Access to Information. It's about who is negotiating the law for access to information. I think it is still limited within a very limited group of people, although they are like have the best like intentions to discuss this law. But I don't think the idea of like access to information has been taken to a larger audience where people can feel the relevance of this law to their daily lives. And this applies to many different laws and legislations that are being addressed. And this is what we're trying to overcome in Tadamul. We would like to show people why access to information is important to their daily life. It's not about like academic research or access to academic resources only, but it's about like their knowledge about the resources that are being granted to their like society or community, and how they can demand for more actually once they know about them, and how they can demand for better distribution for these services. I think the dialogue about like laws like the Act to Access to Information should be more grounded and should be more related to people's life than what's happening right now.
I'd also just like to add to that, to go back to Eddie's question as well, that the access to information law in the Constitution might look better than the last law, but then we have a military, the National Security Council, where everything is conceptualized as a security issue. So there's, as you said, Otto, there's a sort of a sort of supposed progress in the Constitution, but then there's other parts of the Constitution which gets back to the heterogeneity of the state. But I also wanted to add to Eddie's question is that if you look at the United States now, many people would argue we have a completely dysfunctional Congress, right? And on the other hand, some of the most interesting work and most interesting initiatives are coming at the state level and the local level. So the Gay Rights Initiative, gay marriage, other examples, environmental activism is sometimes coming at the very local level or the county level, because like the state of Florida doesn't want to talk about environmental issues. So I think it's also it's also really interesting. It's very possible when you have effective multiple levels of power and authority, that when one level is somehow rendered useless or also too contested, other levels can come. And there are a tremendous number of NGOs, there are a tremendous number of groups mobilizing, big organizations, big coalitions in Egypt. Everybody seems to be mobilizing. And there are things that are happening, and what we're just talking about is seeing that as a positive strength and trying to figure out resources, communication, coalitions to make that happen. The other question about Libya, I mean, we're also very interested in what's happening in other countries and other kinds of coalitions. We try to write about other examples as well. Something like the International Budget Partnership is operative. There's the ANSA network that works on social auditing and social accountability. There's many international organizations. Ricky works for Human Rights Watch. There's a lot of international organizations and networks that are working across the region, and we hope to be able to also learn more about them and also to kind of have the sorts of coalitions that they're working on. We could publicize them in our work. I was just looking at the International Budget Partnership. They have great case studies of things happening all over the world about very local communities getting access to information and fighting for more social accountability, and actually success stories. And you can look at their website and they have them.
Can I add something
yes,
really quick
Adel.
to what Karim said? Okay, so I think even though the question was posed to me, I think Karim answered it very succinctly and with sort of on-the-ground pointers. I think it's absolutely key, despite the fact that it appears as though the political spaces are shutting down now, that the state is experiencing a resurgence, is to acknowledge the fact that most of these local initiatives are driven by need. And that, of course, renders the impetus and the pressure into one that is extremely personalized on the part of many of these communities. So that's part of the reason why Karim's response was rather than black or white, where it's completely shutting down versus completely opening up. He was actually talking about how local communities are thinking of strategy, whether it's NGO focused or legislative or various pressure points with the state. And it's also important to recognize that even in its most sort of arduously suffocating configuration under the sort of the Mubarak era, whether it's earlier or even prior to that, that there were always local initiatives at various points. Maybe they're more recognizable to us now because there's much better reporting, there's much better sort of connectivity, and also the ability for us to kind of translate success stories from one locale to the other is much more pronounced. But in general, when it comes to actual initiatives, as Karim explained with some of the early examples, some of these initiatives began in the 1980s and in the 1990s and registered successes to various degrees. So I don't think that it'll ever shut down enough. And I think the state, by and large, now recognizes that it simply cannot control, that it has to concede both space and policy in many instances, particularly on a local level. And I imagine that perhaps in the long term, even something as ambitious as the 2050 project, as fantastical as it may seem, will slowly sort of will trickle down as an inconceivable, impractical idea. At least in the manner in which it's conceived, in the same way that the cure for HIV or the cure for Hep C all of a sudden kind of trickles down. And there's this moment of realization. Well, obviously this was either too lofty, too fantastical, or too, to go back to Baudrillard, it is the simulacra. It is that sort of entity. So I think it's very encouraging, and one shouldn't feel that because there is sort of an increase in repression, that it means these local initiatives will cease to exist, or that communities won't continue to make demands and think of creative ways to circumvent the resurgence of the state.
I think, unfortunately, we have to stop. We've gone way over. With the conversation will continue. We have food for people. Karim, would you like to make any final comment? Or I would also just like to thank everybody involved in hosting this, particularly Rachel back there, and very much everybody in the Cairo office who has contributed so much to this as well. Karim? And our panelists, of course, thank you so much for coming. and our audience. Kareem?
He's silent.
Kareem, is your microphone on mute by any chance?
Your microphone.
Yes,
There we go.
I would just like to thank everybody actually who made this possible, because it was supposed to be 3 weeks ago while I was in DC, but then thank God we've been able to have this event after all. And I'd like to thank the team in Washington and the team in Cairo, and especially Muhammad Adel, who's been helping me here, actually tweeting about the event itself. And I hope we can be able to repeat these meetings, or let's say sessions later on with more topics and things to push forward the project. And thanks to Adel also been really insightful about this, and I really enjoyed these comments on the project. I think it was really good. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming, and please join us for some lunch.